There are places on Earth that exist and yet don't exist. Right now, as you watch this, there are settlements, complete with apartment buildings, schools, hospitals, parks, where thousands of people wake up, go to work, raise families. Places with streets and squares and history stretching back decades. But if you try to find them on a map, you'll discover nothing. An empty forest, a notation for a village that doesn't exist, a postal code that leads nowhere. These aren't legends. They aren't conspiracy theories. They're documented places that held, and in some cases still hold, some of the most dangerous secrets in human history. Cities built in secrecy, where the very fact of their existence was classified, where children grew up without addresses, where residents couldn't tell their own relatives where they lived. For over 40 years, entire urban populations lived lives that officially never happened. But what if everything we thought we knew about maps, about geography, about the permanence of place itself is wrong? Today, we'll embark on a journey through evidence that challenges everything we believe about the relationship between human settlement and recorded reality. We'll explore places that were home to hundreds of thousands, yet existed only in classified documents. Cities that produced the weapons that could end civilization, yet appeared on no civilian map. Brace yourselves, we begin. In 1946, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, Soviet physicist Igor Kurchatov noticed something strange in the newly established research facility near the ancient monastery town of Sarov, 400 kilometers east of Moscow. The town had existed for centuries, a holy site, a place of pilgrimage, but after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, it was closed. And then, in the late 1940s, it vanished entirely, not physically, but from every map, every census, every official document produced by the Soviet government. Sarov became Arzamas 16, not a real name, a postal code, a postbox. To understand why an entire city would be erased from existence, we need to understand the fundamental principle of the closed city, what the Soviets called zato, or Zakrytie Administrativno-Territorialno Obrazovanie, closed administrative territorial formation. The concept is elegantly simple. Create a complete urban environment, thousands of residents, full infrastructure, schools, hospitals, shops, but isolate it so completely from the outside world that it might as well not exist. Remove it from maps, erase it from census data, give it no real name, only a code. Surround it with barbed wire, guard towers, security checkpoints. Think of it as an urban black hole. Matter and energy exist inside, but no information can escape to the outside world. But here's the paradox that baffled Western intelligence agencies for decades. How do you hide a city? Not a military base, those can be camouflaged. Not a bunker, those can be buried. A city, a place that needs roads, railways, power plants, water systems. A place that generates heat signatures, electromagnetic emissions, requires food deliveries, produces waste. In the 1950s and 60s, American reconnaissance satellites began detecting anomalies in Soviet territory. Heat signatures consistent with populations of 50,000 to 100,000 people in locations where Soviet maps showed only forest. Railway lines that led to blank spaces. Power consumption equivalent to major cities emanating from coordinates that officially contained nothing but wilderness. CIA analysts called these locations the ghost cities. Soviet defectors whispered about them, but confirming their existence was nearly impossible. The Soviet Union had created something unprecedented in human history. Cities that existed in physical reality, but not in documented reality. How did the scientific community initially react to reports of these places? With profound skepticism. The idea seemed absurd. In the age of satellite reconnaissance, in the modern era of global communication, how could an entire city, let alone dozens of them, simply not exist on any map? A 1963 CIA analysis stated, "The concept of populated areas totally absent from cartographic records stretches credibility. yet electromagnetic and thermal evidence suggests otherwise. But the accumulating data pushed analysts toward an uncomfortable conclusion: the impossible was real. The Soviet Union had not only hidden cities, it had created an entire parallel geography, a network of urban spaces that existed in a liminal state between reality and secrecy. And the most unsettling part, the people living in these vanished places had no choice. They were trapped in cities that, to the outside world, didn't exist. At the Russian State Archive in Moscow, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, researchers discovered the first comprehensive documentation of the Zato system. The numbers were staggering. At the height of the Cold War, there were approximately 42 closed cities spread across the Soviet Union. Their combined population exceeded 1.5 million people. Not soldiers, not temporary workers, permanent residents, families, children born into cities with no names. Let's examine the evidence city by city. Arzamas 16, now Sarov, located 400 kilometers east of Moscow, established 1946. This was ground zero, where Igor Kurchatov developed the first Soviet atomic bomb, the RDS-1, detonated in 1949. Population at peak, approximately 87,000 people. For 4 decades, these 87,000 residents lived in a city that appeared on no map except classified military documents. Mail sent there was addressed to Arzamas Postbox 16, a code referring to a mailbox in the city of Arzamas, 60 kilometers away. Chelyabinsk 65, now Ozersk, established 1947 in the Ural Mountains, 15 kilometers from the city of Chelyabinsk. This facility housed the Mayak plutonium production plant, one of the most dangerous industrial sites in human history. Peak population, over 100,000 people. The scale comparison is crucial to understand. Ozersk wasn't a small research outpost. It was larger than many regional capitals. It had 18 schools, 3 hospitals, multiple shopping centers, a theater, parks and recreational facilities, public transportation system, all existing in a place that, according to every publicly available map, contained nothing but forest. American thermal satellite imagery from the 1960s detected thermal heat signatures at the Ozersk coordinates consistent with a population of 80,000 to 100,000. The thermal profile matched a major industrial city, residential heating, power generation, industrial processes. But Soviet maps of the region showed only the designation Kishtim, a small village 8 kilometers away, and vast stretches of uninhabited taiga. The traditional interpretation was that satellites were malfunctioning, that thermal anomalies were natural geological phenomena. But this explanation fails when we examine the electromagnetic evidence. Radio intercepts from the 1950s onward detected transmissions, civilian radio, television broadcasts, telephone communications, emanating from locations shown as empty on Soviet maps. The volume and character of these signals were consistent with substantial urban populations. You can hide a city on paper, you can remove road signs and railway stops, but you cannot hide the electromagnetic signature of tens of thousands of people living modern lives. As satellite imagery improved through the 70s and 80s, the evidence became undeniable. Nighttime imagery showed blazing concentrations of artificial light, street lamps, building illumination, industrial facilities, in areas marked as wilderness. The pattern repeated across the Soviet Union. Sverdlovsk 44, now Novoralsk, population 95,000, nuclear fuel processing. Sverdlovsk 45, now Lesnoy, population 51,000, nuclear weapons research. Krasnoyarsk 26, now Zhelnogorsk, population 94,000, plutonium production deep in Siberian forest. Each represented tens of thousands of lives lived in geographic limbo. Each generated the full signature of urban existence, thermal, electromagnetic, chemical, while officially existing nowhere.
The most compelling evidence came from high-altitude reconnaissance. SR-71 Blackbird missions in the 1970s photographed what appeared to be substantial cities, clearly visible apartment blocks, industrial facilities, transportation infrastructure, at coordinates where Soviet maps showed nothing. One analyst's report from 1975 stated, photographic evidence shows an urban center of approximately 60,000 to 80,000 residents. Soviet topographical maps of identical coordinates show uninhabited forest. The contradiction cannot be reconciled. But this is only one fragment of a much stranger picture. The closed cities weren't just hidden geographically, they were hidden temporally. They existed in a kind of bureaucratic time warp, where residents were issued internal passports with addresses that didn't officially exist, where children were born with birth certificates listing cities that appeared on no map. The infrastructure for erasure went far beyond cartography. It was a total system of geographic negation.
In 2012, researchers at the University of Cambridge published a study analyzing the long-term consequences of the Zato system. What they discovered was even more paradoxical than the existence of the cities themselves. The closed cities hadn't just vanished from maps, they had created a parallel society, a kind of shadow population that existed in Soviet statistics but not in Soviet geography. Census data showed anomalies that Western demographers couldn't explain. The Soviet Union's official population figures included residents of closed cities, but regional and municipal breakdowns excluded them. The mathematics didn't add up. Roughly 1.5 million people existed in national totals, but vanished when you examined provincial and local statistics. It was as if 1.5 million Soviet citizens lived nowhere, distributed across the entire country and simultaneously present in none of its regions. Dr. Michael Ellman, Soviet Studies, Cambridge University. But the most shocking discovery connected to the closed cities emerged not from demographic studies, but from environmental monitoring in the early 2000s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Western scientists gained access to regions previously forbidden. What they found around several Zato locations was evidence of environmental catastrophe on a scale that had been completely hidden from the world. Near Ozersk, Chelyabinsk 65, satellite and ground-based radiation monitoring detected contamination levels exceeding those found at Chernobyl. The Mayak plutonium plant had experienced numerous accidents, including a catastrophic explosion in 1957 that released radiation equivalent to approximately 20 million curies, one of the largest nuclear disasters in history. But because Ozersk didn't officially exist, the disaster was never reported. The contamination affected hundreds of thousands of people, but because the city wasn't on maps, the victims were statistically invisible. Environmental sampling in the Teka River, which flows from the Mayak facility, detected plutonium concentrations 76 million times higher than safe limits. Cesium-137 levels in lake sediments near Chelyabinsk 65, 600 million becquerels per kilogram. Radiation density typically found in reactor cores. The scale is almost incomprehensible. An area of approximately 23,000 square kilometers around Ozersk was severely contaminated. That's roughly the size of New Jersey. An entire region rendered hazardous, but because the city causing the contamination didn't exist on maps, the contamination zone wasn't officially acknowledged until the 1990s. This evidence points beyond the concept of hidden cities and leads toward a more disturbing reality: geographic erasure as a tool for concealing consequences. If a city doesn't exist, then accidents in that city don't exist. If residents have addresses that aren't on maps, then illnesses affecting those residents don't appear in regional health statistics. The closed cities weren't just removed from maps, they were removed from accountability.
Research published in 2015 by the International Journal of Radiation Biology analyzed archival documents about a Zato facility called Znamensk, formerly Kapustin Yar, established 1948 as a missile testing range. What they discovered was a paper trail that didn't just erase the city, it erased deaths. Between 1950 and 1965, approximately 47 people died in rocket explosions and accidents at the Kapustin Yar test site. But because Znamensk didn't exist on official records, these deaths were never registered in the Soviet public health system. The victims were buried in unmarked graves. Their families received no acknowledgement because acknowledging the deaths would require acknowledging the city's existence. The evidence accumulated over decades paints a picture far stranger than mere secrecy. The Zato system created an entire category of human existence that was physically real but documentarily absent. Lives lived, work performed, accidents suffered, deaths occurring, all in a space that, according to official geography, was empty. This raises a profound question. If a city exists but appears on no map, if people live there but their addresses are classified, if disasters occur but cannot be reported because the location is secret, then in what sense do these events happen? The closed cities existed in a kind of ontological limbo, real enough to generate electromagnetic signatures and radioactive waste, real enough that residents needed food, water, shelter, but unreal enough that they could be excluded from maps, censuses, statistics, history itself.
Dr. Kate Brown, professor of science and technology studies at MIT, proposed the primary theory explaining the Zato system in her 2013 book, Plutopia: Nuclear Families, Atomic Cities, and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. The closed city represents the ultimate expression of Cold War paranoia meeting industrial ambition. To build nuclear weapons, you need cities. But to keep nuclear secrets, you need those cities to not exist, Dr. Kate Brown. Brown's theory centers on an irreconcilable tension. Nuclear weapons production requires massive industrial infrastructure, thus cities, but nuclear secrecy requires the absence of public knowledge, thus invisibility. The Zato system resolved this paradox through what Brown calls atomized urbanism, the creation of complete urban environments that exist in physical space but are atomized, broken down into components so discrete and classified that they cannot coalesce into publicly acknowledged reality. But Brown's theory faces significant challenges. Critics point out that other nuclear powers, the United States, Britain, France, developed atomic weapons without completely erasing cities from maps. Los Alamos was classified, but it still appeared on maps. The Hanford site in Washington state was restricted, but not cartographically denied. So why did the Soviet system take geographic secrecy to this extreme? Alternative theories have emerged from historians specializing in Soviet governance. Dr. Egle Rindizevichute at the University of Geneva argues that the Zato system wasn't primarily about nuclear secrecy, it was about creating zones of bureaucratic exception. In Rindizevichute's interpretation, closed cities served as laboratories for a kind of governance that bypassed normal Soviet administrative structures. Because Zato cities didn't officially exist in regional jurisdictions, they answered directly to Moscow, or more precisely, to specific ministries or military divisions. This created islands of concentrated power and resources. Residents of closed cities received apartments allocated faster than normal Soviet citizens, average wait 3 to 5 years versus 10 to 15 years, access to special stores with imported goods unavailable elsewhere, higher salaries, typically 30 to 50% above regional averages, guaranteed employment, superior health care. The cities were erased from maps, but for residents, this erasure came with privileges. The theory suggests geographic invisibility as the price of economic advantage.
At the 2019 European Association for Urban History Conference, Russian historian Dr. Nikolai Rabotnov presented research into the psychological effects of living in non-existent places. His interviews with former Zato residents revealed a striking pattern. Many described a feeling of living in parallel time. They knew the outside world existed, they could listen to foreign radio broadcasts, some could travel with special permits, but they existed in a space that was temporarily disconnected from that world. One former resident of Krasnoyarsk 26 recalled, "My daughter asked me in 1978, if our city doesn't exist, do we exist? I had no answer." This brings us to an unexpected connection. The closed cities echo ancient philosophical concepts about the relationship between place and being. In Aristotle's physics, he argued that place, topos, is fundamental to existence. For something to be, it must be somewhere. The Zato system inverted this. Things could be cities, populations, industrial complexes, while having no topos, no officially recognized somewhere. Medieval scholastic philosophy debated whether beings could exist without occupying space. The consensus was no, existence requires location. Yet the closed cities seemed to prove otherwise. They were what philosophers might call beings without being there. Even more intriguingly, historian Anna Krylova at Duke University has drawn connections between the Zato system and Russian Orthodox concepts of invisible cities, spiritual spaces that exist in faith but not in physical reality. Ancient Russian folklore includes numerous tales of hidden monasteries and holy cities that cannot be found by unbelievers. They exist for the faithful but remain invisible to others. When the Bolsheviks closed the Sarov monastery in 1917 and later transformed it into Arzamas 16, they may have inadvertently created a secular version of these legendary invisible holy places. The sites retained their quality of hiddenness, but now in service of atomic physics rather than divine mystery. The phenomenon wasn't uniquely Soviet. Post-Soviet Russia maintains 43 Zato cities. China has similar closed areas, particularly in Xinjiang and Tibet. North Korea's entire city of Pyeongsan, a uranium mining and processing center, doesn't appear on official maps distributed outside the country. Even the United States maintained quasi-closed cities. Area 51 in Nevada wasn't officially acknowledged until 2013. The town of Mercury, Nevada, built for nuclear test site workers, has restricted access and limited public documentation. But none achieved the total geographic negation of the Soviet Zato system. So, which theory explains it? Nuclear secrecy? Bureaucratic power? Psychological control? Philosophical experimentation with the nature of place and being? The answer may be all of them simultaneously. The closed cities were multifaceted phenomena that served overlapping purposes: military, political, economic, even metaphysical. They represented the Soviet state's ultimate power, not just to control space, but to determine what counts as space. Not just to govern people, but to govern the relationship between people and place itself.
Let's weave together everything we've discovered into a single, coherent narrative. In 1946, the Soviet Union began a radical experiment, creating complete urban environments that would exist in physical reality but be erased from documentary reality. Over the following decades, they built 42 such cities, housing 1.5 million people that appeared on no public maps, were excluded from official statistics, and were known only by postal codes rather than names. These cities produced the weapons and infrastructure for Soviet nuclear capability. They generated the same signatures of urban life: electromagnetic emissions, thermal output, resource consumption as any major city, but they were cartographically invisible. American reconnaissance detected their presence through satellite imagery, but couldn't reconcile the contradiction. How could something that clearly existed not exist?
The environmental consequences of activities in these hidden cities, nuclear accidents, radiation contamination, industrial disasters, went unreported for decades because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the cities themselves. Residents lived in a state of ontological paradox. They had addresses that didn't appear on maps, worked in facilities that officially weren't there, suffered illnesses from exposure to materials whose production was classified. But here's what this reveals about the relationship between reality and documentation, between existence and acknowledgement. Maps don't just represent geography, they constitute what counts as geography. For centuries, we've operated under the assumption that maps describe reality, that cartography is a neutral recording of what's there. The Zato system proved otherwise. Maps create reality by determining what is officially there and what is not. A city excluded from maps doesn't just become hard to find, it becomes hard to think about. It falls outside the conceptual framework by which we organize space. Cognitive scientists have shown that humans primarily navigate using mental maps constructed from official representations, road maps, GPS systems, geographic databases. When something is absent from these representations, it becomes cognitively invisible, even if it's physically present. The Zato cities existed in a cognitive blind spot created by their cartographic absence. This reshapes our understanding of several fundamental concepts. Reality. We discovered that physical existence is not sufficient for social reality. The Zato cities were materially real. You could walk their streets, live in their apartments, but they lacked social reality because they were excluded from the documentary systems that create shared knowledge. One person's experience of a place, living there, working there, is real but private. A place only becomes socially real when it enters collective documentation, maps, census data, official records. The closed cities had private reality, but not collective reality. Nature. The environmental contamination around Zato facilities raises unsettling questions about how we understand ecological damage. If contamination occurs in a place that officially doesn't exist, in what sense has nature been harmed? Radiation doesn't recognize cartographic boundaries. Cesium-137 spreads whether or not the place where it was released appears on maps. Yet the societal response to ecological damage depends on that damage being documentable, reportable, officially acknowledged. For decades, vast regions were ecologically devastated, but couldn't be ecologically protected because protection requires first acknowledging the damage, which requires acknowledging the source, which requires acknowledging the city. Time. Perhaps most profoundly, the Zato system reveals that time itself is not uniform. Residents of closed cities lived in a different temporal stream than the rest of Soviet society. Events in their lives, births, marriages, deaths, were recorded in classified documentation but excluded from public chronology. Accidents happened, disasters occurred, but these events didn't enter historical time because they weren't publicly documented. They existed in a kind of parallel temporal flow that ran alongside official history but never intersected with it. History is what gets written down and shared. Without that, events occur but don't become historical. The Zato residents lived lives that happened but couldn't become history. Dr. Yakov Robotnov, oral historian. The universe. On the largest scale, the Zato system forces us to confront a disturbing question about the nature of existence itself. We assume the universe is objectively there, that reality exists independent of our knowledge of it. But the Zato system created spaces that existed in some frameworks, physics, material reality, but not in others, geography, social reality, and history. This suggests reality is not monolithic, but layered. Different systems of knowledge and documentation create different realities that can exist simultaneously without contradiction. The cities were real in thermal signatures, but unreal in maps, real to satellites, but unreal to civilians, real to residents, but unreal to the nation. Multiple versions of reality, incompatible yet coexisting. Standing at the intersection of all this evidence, we face an inescapable conclusion. The Zato cities reveal that what we call the world is not a single objective reality waiting to be discovered and mapped. It's a construction, built from physical existence and documentary systems. Change the documentation and you change the world. Exclude something from official records, you excise it not just from maps, but from the shared reality those maps help create. The Soviet state didn't just hide military secrets, it demonstrated the ultimate power, the power to determine what is real by controlling what is documentable, mappable, knowable. And in doing so, it created one of the most profound paradoxes of the modern era. Cities that were everywhere and nowhere. Populations that existed and didn't exist. A geography that was simultaneously material and impossible.
So what happens next? In 2024, we live in an age of unprecedented cartographic transparency. Commercial satellites with resolution down to 30 centimeters orbit the Earth. Google Maps has photographed almost every street on the planet. GPS systems track locations to within meters. Several technologies and projects are currently underway that could finally make the complete erasure of cities impossible. Planet Labs operates a constellation of over 200 satellites that photograph the entire Earth's landmass every single day. Unlike sporadic military reconnaissance, this creates a comprehensive daily record of human settlement that's publicly available. The European Space Agency's Sentinel program provides free, open-access radar and optical imagery with resolution sufficient to identify individual buildings. This data is updated continuously and preserved permanently. OpenStreetMap, a crowdsourced global mapping project, has made cartographic data democratic. Thousands of volunteers continuously update maps using satellite imagery, making it nearly impossible for any location to remain undocumented. But here's the crucial question. Will these technologies actually prevent future Zato-like erasures? Early evidence suggests not necessarily. Even now, in 2024, Russia still maintains 43 officially closed cities. Their locations are known. Satellites have photographed them. Their existence is acknowledged, but access remains restricted. They exist in a new kind of liminal state, visible but sealed. China's closed areas in Xinjiang cover regions larger than many European countries. Satellite imagery reveals extensive infrastructure, but information about what occurs there remains classified. The cities are mapped, but their reality remains opaque. North Korea has successfully kept numerous military cities functionally invisible despite satellite coverage. We can see the buildings, but without ground access, without residents who can communicate freely, the cities remain socially unreal. The nature of erasure is changing. In the 20th century, states erased cities from maps. In the 21st century, cities appear on maps, but their meaning remains erased. We can see them, but we can't know them. Perhaps the next evolution of the closed city isn't cartographic invisibility, but informational opacity. Upcoming missions and experiments that could fundamentally change this? The International Space Station's EcoStress mission will create detailed thermal maps of the entire planet at 70-meter resolution, updating every few days. This will make it possible to detect and monitor any significant human settlement based on heat signatures alone, independent of official documentation. Starlink and similar satellite internet constellations are creating global connectivity that makes information blackouts increasingly difficult. If residents of closed cities can communicate with the outside world via satellite internet, the informational seal begins to crack. AI-powered satellite analysis is becoming sophisticated enough to not just identify cities, but analyze them, estimate populations, track construction, monitor economic activity. These systems could create a parallel, independent documentation of human settlement that governments cannot control. Within 10 to 15 years, we may reach a threshold where complete erasure becomes technologically impossible, where the infrastructure required for a city automatically generates a digital footprint that cannot be suppressed. But would that truly solve the problem? Remember our opening question: what does it mean for a city to exist?
We began this journey thinking it was about maps and secrecy, but we've discovered it's about something deeper, the relationship between material reality and social reality, between being and being known. Even if every square meter of Earth is photographed, even if AI can detect and analyze every human settlement, cities can still be erased in ways that matter more than cartography. They can be erased from historical narratives, excluded from economic statistics, omitted from political representation, made cognitively invisible while remaining physically visible. The Zato cities taught us that existence is not binary. Something isn't simply real or unreal. Existence operates across multiple dimensions: physical, social, historical, political, cognitive. You can exist in some dimensions while being erased from others. And perhaps that's the most unsettling revelation. The closed cities weren't aberrations. They were extreme examples of something that happens everywhere, all the time. There are neighborhoods in major cities today that appear on maps but are socially invisible to most residents. Communities that exist but are systematically excluded from economic development, political representation, historical memory. Different mechanisms than the Zato system, but the same fundamental effect: existence without full reality. So as we close, we return to our Zamos 16, now Sarov, where this story began. The city exists now on official maps. You can find it in GPS databases, but parts of it remain closed. The nuclear facility still operates. Certain areas require clearance. Sarov has transitioned from complete erasure to partial visibility. It exists and doesn't exist simultaneously. A Schrödinger city collapsed into a superposition of real and secret. A city that was erased can be restored to maps, but can it be restored to reality? Or does something fundamental break when a place spends decades existing and not existing at once? Former resident of Sarov. The answer remains unknown. What we know is this: for 40 years, 1.5 million people lived in places that were nowhere. They worked, loved, raised children, grew old, died, all in cities that officially didn't exist. They left behind a question that will haunt us far longer than the Cold War that created them. If you can erase a city from maps, what else can you erase from reality? And more terrifyingly, what's being erased right now that we can't see?